Kia hora te marino kia whakapapapaunamu te moana. E huarahi mā tātou I te rangi nei, aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou ia tātou katoa. Uie, taeki e. Tēnā koutou katoa, mihi mai o hakia koutou, kua tai mai nei ki te tautoko te kaupapa o tēnei rā. Nau mai ki tō mātou kōrero. I'm Moira Clooney, I'm project lead for Te Ngako Kahukura. Welcome to some familiar names on our participant list and others who I haven't met yet. I'm joined today by my colleagues, John O'Sello, who's our practice lead, and Joey McDonald, who is our training lead. And I'll give them a chance to introduce themselves in a minute and talk about their hopes for our session today. So today we're talking about moving from awareness to action. How can we take the energy we're seeing for trans inclusion in this Trans Week of Awareness, the Sky City lit up in trans flag colours, the cupcakes, the social media posts. How can we take all of that energy and excitement and enthusiasm and turn it into real change that will benefit trans people? We'll have a bit of a corridor about our thoughts on that question, and then we'll have some time for your questions as well. So if you have a question or you want to share your thoughts, just pop those in the chat. We'll keep an eye on that through the session. We might not necessarily cover off all the questions that you have today, so I'd encourage you to check out our website, read more, and please do get in touch if you want to ask us anything else. Just before I hand over to the other two, to let them say something, I'll just say a little bit about Te Ngako Kahukura, our work. So Te Ngako Kahukura has a vision overall really of an Aotearoa where rainbow people, where queer, trans and intersex people grow up feeling safe, feeling valued, and that they belong in all the places where they live, they learn, they access support services, access healthcare, which sounds non-controversial, right? Who wouldn't want that for all of our young people? But unfortunately, there's still quite a lot of work to do to make that real. So we, as a team, we work at a systems change level. We work with people and organisations who influence systems, whether that's funders, politicians, researchers, training providers, sector bodies, government agencies, service providers, to grow their understanding of rainbow populations and issues and help people do the work really that's needed within their own sphere of influence, within what they're able to do. We worked with Dr. Elizabeth Kerekere to find our name, Te Ngako Kahukura, and this is what's up on screen now is a whakatauki that she gave to us to speak to our work, kia puawai, me puawai. And we really think about this in terms of, you know, in order for our rainbow communities and people to flourish and thrive and live the beautiful lives that they're entitled to, that they deserve, really we must all grow, we must all do the work. And our work is really about helping people to do that work, to understand what that might be, to strengthen their services and grow their practice. So that's us. I'll hand over to Joey and Jono to say a bit more about this session today.
Cool. Kia ora, Moira. Thanks everyone for showing up, and lovely to see people introducing themselves in the chat. I'm going to say a little bit, and Jono, please chip in anytime you like about what we think the purpose of this conversation today is. Jono's also monitoring our chat, so they might be, you know, busy doing that for some of this. We were thinking about Trans Week of Awareness and thinking about how arguably in our area of work, every week is Trans Week of Awareness or Trans Week of being tired. And something that we really want this conversation to be about is not so much Trans 101 and not even so much a list of key actions that we would want our allies or our champions to do, although those are important, and there are some handouts from today which might stir some more thoughts about actions you could take. But really we want to think about long-term institutional change, and we want to think about acknowledging the amazing things that our educators, especially the trans educators or non-binary educators who are working in that space from their own experience as well as their professional knowledge, to really acknowledge the intense amount of labor that people are doing, particularly maybe at this time of year, this week, and think about what we can do to support that work. There are at least 2 different audiences that we're thinking of for this webinar, which include, right, trans and non-binary people who are working in trans non-binary related sectors, health or social services or community development or whatever, who are quite often called upon to do this work, whether that's paid or unpaid or whatever. So that's one aspect of an audience, people who we really want to acknowledge and give a lot of love and support to. And then the other side is people who are working in organisations that are often providing health or social services, or maybe working at a policy level, if not service delivery, who would think of themselves as allies or champions, maybe rainbow champions or trans allies, or for whatever reason motivated by wanting their workplace to be safe for other trans, non-binary, rainbow people, but also beyond workplace safety, thinking about how the services that they're offering or what their organisation does, how that can better meet the needs of trans and non-binary people or populations or communities, how you can support the work that our organisations are already doing. So those are the 2 audiences we were kind of thinking of. Is there anything you wanted to add as a kind of the purpose of today, Jono? It's, not mandatory.
I feel like y'all really covered it.
Right.
I think the only other thing that I would add in here is just thinking about, I'm always really keen to see how we think about the diversity, and I use that word carefully, but the diversity within our trans and non-binary whānau as well, that it can be dangerous when we're just starting to ask the question of, oh, can we get a trans person to come and tell the trans experience, and framing it up as the trans experience or the non-binary experience, which there's way more than a single experience. And then when we add cultural paradigms in as well, that brings like whole new levels of different experiences to the table. So I'm always keen to talk about those things as well.
Yeah, cool. It's so relevant because some of the conversations in the background that the 3 of us have been having in relation to Trans Week of Awareness are how we see, the double-edged sword of increased visibility about broadly trans populations or trans issues or trans stuff, like in public discourse and in mainstream media. So there's a double-edged sword where in some ways that's helpful for progressing towards more inclusion and more respect and more understanding broadly about trans lives, trans experiences. But then there's also quite a lot of negative pushback, a lot of transphobia out there, a lot of racism interacting with transphobia, a lot of public discourse that's really quite scary. So what's it like to be a trans person if you get asked to really front this work? And in some cases, like, people are supported and held by an organization, and that organization may or may not be a specifically trans or rainbow organization, but hopefully people feel supported and cared for by the organization that they're doing work for and with. But the reality is often people don't, because the organization they are working in also may not be totally up to speed, and they might be trying to do both internal work and work with other people who they've identified as people who want to make change in a positive way in that organization, and do external work trying to improve services or improve responsiveness to trans communities and respect for trans people. So it's quite a context, because we wanted, obviously it's Trans Week of Awareness now, and that's particularly bringing to mind the kinds of labour that trans people get asked to do in this week. But it's also really relevant to Pride, happening next February and happening every February. So it's like every February and every November, there's a whole lot of labour that people are being asked to do. And if you are not a trans or non-binary person, or not someone who's connected to that world, either on a personal level or a professional level, you might not realize how much work we're already being asked to do in those times. And you might not realize how important it would be to get in touch with us before that. So probably don't contact us immediately before this week or immediately before February saying, oh, I'd really like to do a talk or a presentation or a workshop. Can you come in? Because chances are we're quite busy this week, or we're quite tired and might appreciate the relationship building happening over time. So one of our key messages to all of our allies and champions is certainly to reach out to the rainbow and trans organizations. There are lists available in lots of places, but certainly on our website, and find out what those organizations are doing already. Find out what you can connect up with. That's one other key message that I think we want to get across. So I have a question. We have a few questions to work through ourselves, and then as questions come through in the chat, we'll start responding to those too. But Moira, can I ask you a question now? So what do you think would really make a difference if someone is trying to make their organization more trans inclusive? How are they going to make that work the most effective it can be?
Yeah, thanks. I feel like that's quite a big question. There's lots of different ways of answering it. I think in an ideal world, where you would start would be with leadership buy-in, like having whoever is the decision maker, whoever's in charge, really see that it's a priority, and with a bit of a plan. So having a think about in your organization, what does your organization do? What's your strategy? And how does trans inclusion fit into that? So often you might be working on services around supporting young people or supporting families or some general purpose, and within that, having a think about what trans inclusion would look like and what are the kind of actions you would take to fit that into your strategy. And so, I guess in an ideal world, whoever has the decision-making power would be like, yep, sweet, I can see that this is a priority for us. This really fits with our organizational vision. Really ready to commit to this, and here's a plan, here's a budget.
Yeah, that's the dream.
Absolutely. I'm going to, make this someone's actual job to do this work and make sure that they've got time, paid time to do this labor, that it isn't just a kind of voluntary thing on top of their regular work. I think in an ideal world, that is a thing that really would support the work to happen. Often that isn't the case. A lot of the great work that we see happening within organizations, isn't from bosses necessarily. It's from amazing allies, amazing trans people who can see an opportunity and want to start somewhere, and so start within their own sphere of influence. And when I think about that, I just think, if you are going to start with something, it's important to kind of think through the consequences and the implications of that. That in this space, it isn't necessarily easy or low stakes to try and bring up topics around trans people or trans identities, and there can be harmful attitudes or behaviours within an organisation. So, like, I'm thinking of a particular service provider that I know about where some of their database people were like, oh yeah, we should update our database so that when a young person comes into our service, we ask them what their gender is. They don't have to just put male or female, they can put male, female, or gender diverse. Wonderful, we'll be more inclusive. So that's great, but they didn't also have the kind of mandate or authority to then train all of their staff about what those words meant or what that implied about how they should provide service. And so it actually ends up, potentially signalling inclusion that isn't really there. So if a young person tells you that they're gender diverse, but the staff that they're then interacting with don't really know what that means or don't know what that implies about how they should behave, then that can probably potentially increase harm.
Totally. We've talked about increasing the risk of increasing visibility by trying to say our service or organization is really rainbow friendly or really trans friendly or really whatever friendly, and putting up a poster or doing whatever that might be. And then the risk of people seeing that and thinking, okay, I will, or seeing on a form that there's an option to tick gender diverse instead of male and female. And we don't love those options, but, seeing some kind of signal and then taking a risk, and then if it's not responded to or held by the organization, and you can't blame the frontline staff who are receiving the forms, or the receptionists, the admin staff who are receiving that information and just haven't been given enough support about what to do with that. What does that mean? How do you talk about that in a waiting room or not? You know, how is that going to be held by the organization? It needs to be, you need to have your people behind you when you're making a statement about what your organization or service is capable of.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think it's, you know, similar to things like if you're going to get people to put pronouns in their email signature, how have you given them enough kind of support and knowledge to know how to respond when somebody approaches them with pronouns that they weren't expecting? If they're going to signal that they're a safe person to disclose that information to, how will you make sure that they actually are safe and inclusive?
Totally. Why are you doing the things you're doing? And it's not weird that staff who just get told this is what you have to do now, or this is the form you use, or this is the format for your email signature, if they don't get told why, or what to expect, or what kinds of conversations you might need to have as an ally when you do that, you're not equipping the staff with the tools that they need to carry that work on, which is obviously, it's a bigger ask to actually have people go through some kind of self-reflection process as part of an education process. You know, it's a much bigger ask for any organization. Yeah. Jono, I know that you are busy monitoring the chat extremely effectively, and I also want to say hi to everybody who's saying hi. Kia ora, it's so nice to have you all here. Love the familiar faces, well, not faces, but, you know, familiar names, and a few people who I don't know as well. Jono, we've been talking about acknowledging the work that trans and non-binary educators do in this space. And I know that as Te Ngākau Kahukura, we often go around saying that labour should be valued, and somehow that should be remunerated, is that the word, or some kind of material recognition of the labour being offered. Why do we say that? Why is it important for trans and non-binary educators to get paid for this work or receive some compensation?
So many reasons. I mean, firstly, our whānau are having to put time and effort into putting this stuff together. Coming in for a talk is never just coming in for a talk. There's all the prep that goes behind it. Even if you're coming in to talk about your experiences of being a trans person, for example, you still have to go in and talk about, you still have to plan all that stuff out. What are you going to say? What are you including in your story? What are you not including in your story? Oh my God, I'm nervous. I need to take a few moments just to breathe and chill out. And afterwards, there's the kind of the come down feeling after you've just been in that full on, okay, I've had all of the adrenaline pumping, and now I just need a cup of tea and a nap before I can get on with my day. So on an energy level, we're putting a lot of energy into that space in order to do the work. So in any other context, you would be paid to do work like that. As a professional facilitator, as somebody who is a teacher, or goes around and does education work for organizations, as a keynote speaker in a conference, you're paid in some way. There's some recognition that context and information and story that you've just brought forward is valuable. So that should not be any different. And it's such a fallacy, and I know that y'all have kind of been talking to it as well, but it's such a fallacy to say, oh, but this is for the community. This is for the good of your people, and we're really going to do this to make sure that you can have a platform and a voice. If you truly want to platform somebody, if you truly want to share your platform for somebody, you need to acknowledge that comes, as Moira said, with a considerable level of risk a lot of the time. And that risk sometimes is not inherently visible to folks who are not part of communities, who are not trans or non-binary themselves, and includes things like being outed in spaces that they weren't expected to being outed in, because the talk was for my work, and yet my church has heard about it. And that was never intended to happen. And there's parts of my story that I didn't necessarily want told in those spaces, but that I do think is important. So it's that whole thing of, at a very baseline level, we need to value the fact that our trans and non-binary whānau are giving their time and energy and effort and personal risk in some cases to these organizations or collectives of folks who want education or want visibility of trans folks in their spaces. But also on a baseline level, that we still got to pay bills. We still live in a capitalist society. That means we have to pay for all the things, and our time and effort has gone into that thing, so adequately pay back. And one thing I say about young people in particular is, if you're asking for their labor, don't just feed them pizza and expect that's enough. So when we're talking about giving them money, paying them, value them for their things, it's got to be more than just like, it's got to be of equal value, if not more than what they're giving. So, you know, a pizza for a 2-hour workshop, not good enough.
Yeah, I think I want to add there too, like in terms of remunerating people for their time and energy and labor and things, it's also about their expertise, you know, like I think as trans and non-binary people, it can feel like it's not really expertise, it's just like talking about your story or your experience, or what's the language that you and your friends and community use to refer to yourselves. But you know, the reason people are asking you to come in and talk about that stuff is because they don't know it, and that's a type of expertise as well that might not have come through going to university and doing a course about it, but through that sort of lived experience and lived expertise, and that's valuable as well.
Hard out. And I think another aspect of this is that if you can't pay someone, if you can't even give them a voucher or pizza, like of course, we might suggest you reconsider how you're approaching this kind of thing. And again, we have a handout from today that people might find helpful. But also, one of the ways that we are motivated to do this work is if we think it's really genuinely part of a wider body of work for an organization or a team, or so if you are trying to think of how you're going to make this worthwhile for someone, while I staunchly believe, you know, trans non-binary people as well as rainbow people more broadly should always get paid for doing the labor, because that's unfortunately under capitalism how we value labor. And like Jono said, we have rent to pay, we have bills, we just need to eat. But even if you can't do that, one of the things you can do is tell us the other things that you're doing that are going to support this work to move forward. So as part of that conversation, acknowledge that next time you have someone come in, you are going to try and seek out budget for this event that includes koha for that person, or you are going to have a conversation with your manager who's going to have a conversation with the CEO, whatever it might be. Because often I find this is frontline staff who are working in a particular role who just really want their team to do better. And so they're just contacting a few people that they know who they've seen do some of this related work. And it's not surprising to me that they would struggle to get budget allocated to this kind of event, or this, especially if it's a one-off event, that's really hard to actually get your organization to monetarily pay for or support, which is why we would encourage people to think about where this work might fit in more broadly, and if it fits against some bigger strategies that the organization has, or if there might be more prep work that you could do with other allies and champions in your team or in your organization to set the ground up, so that if any education does happen, like if anyone does come in and do a lunchtime talk or a presentation or whatever, say it's not like educating, training all of your staff, but a more one-time kind of deal, so that if that happens, there are mechanisms to make the most effective context for that, so that it actually does relate to practice change, it relates to implementation. You know, it's not just that's why obviously I don't love awareness as a goal. I don't think that's a useful goal. I don't sometimes I also relatedly have an issue with inclusion as a goal. I have less worries about it than I do awareness, but I often think, what's the difference between inclusion and liberation? You know, like, so one is asking, can we please be part of the existing things that are happening? And there's value in that. That's really important for anyone. I mean, we're talking about trans non-binary people in particular. So obviously we need systems and services that can meet our needs. And that's important. We need to be included at the very least, but that should be the like lowest ask, right? Like, what would actually support trans liberation, or how is our liberation tied up with everybody else's liberation? Like, and that means challenging power structures, which is much harder, much more long-term work. So it's not strange that it feels difficult, I think, either as a trans educator or as a cis ally or a person who's maybe, you know, identifies as part of rainbow communities and is not themselves trans or non-binary. Like, yeah, it's very motivational to try and get through some of the hardest parts of this work. I think if you can think about how you are not just working to include everybody and work towards equity within the system, but how are you going to transform that system so that people can live better lives in a way that we maybe can't vision yet? You know, like, where are we going to? Where are we trying to get to? We don't have to be so small in our little visions about it. And that's something I get really excited about, talking to other trans and non-binary people who are working in this space. I think there is a conversation that is happening about the difference between, I mean, I might frame it as the difference between inclusion and liberation, but lots of people frame it differently. And it's basically about not accepting the little crumbs and instead aiming to, I don't know, bake an entirely new cake, something, baking metaphor. Yeah. Moira, yes, you are unmuting, please.
Oh, yes, no, I was just going to ask you a question. I think baking a new cake is a wonderful goal, and obviously kind of a longer term, you know, bigger thing. I think in the meantime, we're often working in spaces that are imperfect, where we don't have the kind of levels of influence and resource that we need. So I guess I wanted to ask you, as trans educators who work in this space, how can we support each other and not burn out? You know, what's going on in the conversation about collectively valuing our work about as trans educators?
Goodness, what a great question, Moira. Obviously, it's relevant to what Jono was saying about needing to recognize people's labor and pay us or materially remunerate us. But I think it is relevant to my inclusion versus liberation kind of frame. I think there's a way in which we are moving beyond, I think, accepting that we could just ask to share our experience and hope that that raises some awareness and hope that that results in some kind of change. Like, I've definitely been in that place where you're just kind of like, okay, things are really quite bad, and I'm going to try and just offer whatever I can, whenever I can. And I don't have a particular strategy about that. Like, I've been in that place where you're just like, oh, there's so much need. It's like this massive black hole of need. I just get sucked into it and I do whatever I can, whenever I can. And that's quite different to what I'm seeing now, is a bit more chance to support each other to do the work more effectively. And yeah, that might be things like infrastructure, trying to make a peer group or trying to check in with each other, have people to debrief with, whether that's in your organization or outside your organization. Those are some practical things. But I think it's also about prioritizing having conversations with each other outside of doing work together, and having conversations about what are your dreams and your visions for how this work could go. You know, do you have other people to have those conversations with? And I am so invested in those conversations. So if any trans or non-binary people doing this work want to come and talk to me about dreams and visions and strategies and that big picture stuff, I'm really here for it. And I think a lot of people are actually really here for it. So it's like it's collectively valuing our expertise, yes, expecting to get paid, yes, being willing to ask if somebody wants our labor, what else are they doing? And what else is the organization doing? And is this supported on a broader level? Like, where is this organization at in that process? Those are relevant things to ask, the context in which you do your labor. And I know that we have that tip sheet for trans non-binary educators also attached to this. It's like a handout for this webinar, and it repeats some of these points, which is basically trying to affirm the importance of what you're doing. But it is a lot what you're being asked to do. And if you can think about challenging the power structures, that's not really a thing you can do by yourself. So you're going to need other people with you and to check in with and to vision with. We can't, I mean, I think it's relevant to conversations that Jono and Moira and I have just recently been having about Trans Week of Awareness and Pride, and how both of these things have the potential to be very tokenizing of various different things. And both of those events get recuperated under neoliberal capitalism, right? They kind of become a celebration of individual identity so that it doesn't challenge anything else, so that we don't have to think about poverty, or we don't have to think about healthcare inequity, or we don't have to think about the really hard things that people are genuinely dealing with. It becomes, a kind of, oh, everything's fine, celebration, it's cool, assimilate into mainstream society, you will be fine and accepted, and that will be great. Which obviously is not where Pride came from. And I think Trans Week of Awareness, there's a possibility that we could make it, more about the liberation part and less about the assimilation part. But in order to do that, we need to find each other. We need to have those collective knowledge building conversations. And that's hard because usually we're tired and busy, especially right now. But, thinking about moving beyond celebrations of, you could say, assimilation or respectability politics, not that Pride is only those things at all, and it can be done in an excellent liberatory way, and sometimes is, but also it has the potential all the time to be taken into the dominant social economic system that we're working in currently and kind of spat out the other side as something that doesn't challenge power structures and doesn't talk about colonization and doesn't talk about any of the hard, difficult stuff. And I'm interested in what's going to happen with Trans Week of Awareness on that level too.
Yeah, I think in the context of doing this sort of work as well, the way that it often happens is that there's just one person who's going into an organization to try and help them think about what they could do differently or educate them about pronouns or whatever particular thing it is, right? And I think that's a really hard ask, that if you're going into kind of a dominant paradigm that needs shifting, you're kind of being invited in to work within that kind of framework. Thinking of kind of Moana Jackson talking about kind of this idea of being asked to accept like the way things are. Like the reality is that there's just two genders or whatever, and coming up against kind of like what the reality is can be a really tricky thing, and can be hard to kind of keep your own bearings and your own sort of sense of self. So I think what you say about just having comrades, having colleagues, having people you can go to outside of that and debrief with, and start to actually think about what is your own kind of dream, what is your own kind of paradigm for what the future should be like, so that you're not just working in that context where you're kind of compromising, kind of trying to take some of your values into this system that can only shift so much, right?
Hard out. It's like, how do you hold on to your vision and your ethics while making necessary compromises? Because there is absolutely no way that you would be able to do this work without making compromises. So that's the reality. It's not strange. And if you are just doing it somewhat solo, then you end up feeling like that's on you, that you burn out faster if you think, oh, I couldn't make the change I wanted, or I don't think that talk landed the right way, and I'm so exhausted now, and I like I feel like I didn't manage to shift any of the paradigms that people were thinking about. Like that, you can feel like that's your fault, that there's more, if you had just done more, if you had just done it differently, if you'd just done a better job. But that's not true. It's like, actually the context in which you're doing the work is likely to be responsible more than you as an individual educator. The context will determine how effective your education attempt is. Like, yes, of course, there are pedagogical things you can do that will increase the chances, and there's lots of skills that are completely undervalued about being an educator. But it's really not on you if an organization doesn't progress very far. And I feel like it's so hard for people to, you just burn out so fast when you take it on, and you don't realize that it's not your fault, you know, that we can't do it all by ourselves. We need each other. We need, and that's, I think, one of the reasons why we tell the champions and the allies to connect with organizations and groups rather than contact individuals. Because obviously there are huge amounts of expertise in lots of different ways. Expertise from any trans and non-binary person is going to have expertise in some related area. But if somebody is attached to an organization or a group, and they don't have to be paid, but I mean, ideally they would be, but the reality is often we're not. But as long as you have some kind of collective with you, you're more likely to be able to not just support yourself as you do the work, but like tap into some collective expertise and talk about it on a level where you're not expected to always just refer back to your individual personal experience. You can talk about the organizational approach, and you can talk about the things that you've learned as an organization working in this space, and or research that you've been part of or collaborated with, or, you know, just research you know about. Like, it is a different kind of level of work. So we do encourage often the people who are thinking of working in this space to move outside of just contacting an individual, or to not be offended if you contact an individual and then they want to refer you to or connect you up with an organization who's doing this work. That could be a much more effective way to do it. Like, those organizational relationships are so important. Yeah,
absolutely. I think the other thing I was thinking about in terms of the difficulties of people coming into big institutions to do this work is just, you know, what we were talking about yesterday around institutional knowledge, the importance of organizations not just constantly getting people to come in and talk to them every Trans Week of Awareness about the same thing, but how do they actually build up that institutional knowledge? How do you get your organization to take responsibility for learning about this stuff and really integrating it into the ways that they work?
Yep.
So either of you have thoughts on that?
Jono.
How do you get your organization to take responsibility? You know what? I'm not sure. Joey, do you have any other thoughts?
I think it's genuinely a really big ask. And again, I think it points to the necessity of having a team to do the work with, you know, like you just can't, as an individual ally or champion, do that in your organization on an effective level unless you have other people also supporting that cause, that kaupapa, that work. You know, it needs to be well held, I think. And again, that's asking quite a lot. We have quite high standards, I think, and that's because we really want things to change quite dramatically, and we would like it to be beyond just a stick up a poster kind of approach. And that requires a lot more work. It requires you to do homework. It requires you to do relational work on behalf of the kaupapa. That's not like, oh, I'm just going to build a relationship with a trans or rainbow intersex organization. Of course, that's important. There's organizational relationship building, but then when you're working as an ally or a champion and you want to bridge some institutional knowledge in from those community groups or organizations, it can't just come to you as an individual. There's got to be some mechanism, something, some infrastructure that can take that knowledge and weave it into the strategies, maybe at a strategic level, but also the practices and policies and the implementation of that, whatever the paradigm is that's being brought in, or whatever the knowledge is that's being brought in, how is it going to change the structures of the organization, or how does it flow into the structures of the organization? That means it's going to be a lot more than one person, but it can start with one person, you know, doing that relating and bridging for, usually it's because you have personal experience, whānau, you have a reason why you're motivated to do this, right? So want to really acknowledge the importance of our whānau who are doing work in this space. That's amazing. I see more and more of that all the time, people doing it because they're like, yep, my sibling, my cousin, my auntie, this is my whānau, so that's why I'm here for the work. But again, you can get isolated. You can be taking on too much individually and not trying to figure out how you can make your organization take responsibility for this work. But it's a big ask. So it can take a while.
I was going to say, I think the key thing there is around the balance, right? That you need to keep balance forefronted in the work itself, because on one level, you don't want to, like holding an organization accountable, you don't want to be doing it all by yourself, but you also don't want to feel like you've been completely subsumed by another organization and are just kind of being puppeted or whatever, or feeling like you've lost your own agency to tell that story or to hold that space within your organization. You also don't want to, you want that balance between, like, we don't want everything to be, yay, it's a celebration, yay, the transes. But you also don't want it to flip over to the other side where it's all about, you know, everything is sad and the stats for trans people are terrible and non-binary folks are just as bad and oh, everything is terrible. So it needs to be, it needs to be that balance between, you know, we need spaces that are celebratory and that are joyful and that don't necessarily focus, you know, I don't know, and this is very stereotypical from the top of my mind, but like a knitting circle where you can sit down and not think about, like, we don't have to have the conversation about being a trans person, but it still is an inclusive, and in some ways, depending on where you work, may also be a radical act to create a knitting circle in that space. And on the other side of things, we need to be able to address the fact that we do have bad statistics, and there does need to be advocacy about changing systems and making things better and all of that stuff. But again, that all needs to be collective. And the final part there with that balance is that as you're doing the work, sometimes you get caught up in the violence of it as well. And it's about finding that balance of not getting completely wrapped up that to the point that you burn out with the experience of violence from outside of communities, but also intra-community violence. Because, you know, reality is all of those things exist. And so thinking about forefronting, how do we balance stuff out for ourselves when we're having to lead the charge in a space, and that balance including like the support crew that's behind you, or and if they're not there, who can we build from? Moira, I saw you on before. Did you want to add to that as well?
I remember what I was going to say, something around, I guess, just that general point of, in terms of building institutional knowledge, you know, if you are doing one-off little bits and pieces of things, just that general encouragement to, again, kind of look at the bigger picture, like where does this fit within your organisation? Who should know this stuff? Where should it live? Do you have a organisational intranet or something that you can put a recording of a webinar up on so that everybody who comes through learns about it? Can you build it into your staff induction processes so that you're not having to get trans people to have to come in and re-explain the same things over and over again and have the same conversations? It's just part of the professional expectations of working in your organisation. It's just part of the kind of culture, part of how we do things.
That relates so much to the pros and cons of whether this work happens by getting someone external to the organization come in and do something, whether it's a one-off or a longer process, whatever it is, or whether you are relying on internal staff, but without giving them extra time or paying them for that particular labor. What we find often is big organizations who have a lot of staff will ask existing staff members who may or may not be in a position to say no easily, because if someone, if their manager is asking them something, are they actually going to feel comfortable to say, no, doing a lunchtime talk feels a bit full on actually in this context? Like, it's very hard if you work for an organization and when jobs are not easy to come by, you don't want to imperil your job by saying no to a request where someone, say they're your manager, they won't understand why what they're asking you to do is so difficult or potentially a risk, or they won't understand what safety mechanisms you might need to have around you if someone is hostile or something goes wrong in that space. Like, it's not a guarantee that will be safe for you. So yes, it's good to try and recognize the expertise and skills and knowledge that your own staff have, but it is really not cool to just expect them to put that on display as part of their current role, which probably has nothing to do with that part of their life, or even if it does, I would argue if it's not in their job description, don't ask them to do it. It's because the context in which you're asking is a bit fraught. So obviously there are people who are going to really step up and want to do that kind of work internal to the organization. And I respect that completely if it's what people want to do. But it's very different if you're an ally or a champion who's not trans or non-binary and you're approaching trans or non-binary staff members to hold some of this for you. Big ask, please be mindful of what you're asking someone to do and the context in which you're asking them to do it.
Yeah, that also made me think about, regardless of if it's a internal staff member or if you're asking someone to come in and talk, just having a think about what your goal is, what you're wanting people to learn from it, and being a bit reflective about what you're asking people to talk about and whether you're expecting them to share their personal story or how you're dealing with questions, like any questions that they might come up against around their own life and their personal story. I guess as an educator, I guess we wanted to kind of make the point that it's not, your story belongs to you, and it's, you have choices around what you share and don't share, and that's always a really good practice if you're going in to talk about trans things, to kind of think about what you want to share and what your boundaries are around that, and communicate them if you need to. That it's not, you're not obliged to share every detail of your personal story.
Even if people straight up directly ask, or especially if they directly ask, like having some kind of stock response that says, I'm not actually going to answer that question, but here are some thoughts that I have about the topic that you're raising. Reframe it away from your personal immediate experience if you want to. And it's likely that people will want, right? As an educator, you probably are working in the space where people want to emotionally connect with what you're saying. That's the most effective facilitation or education technique, right? Is to give people feelings while you're teaching them something, and they'll remember the feelings when they don't remember what it is that you said. And so if the feelings are discomfort and worry because you forced them to reflect on their practice and it was hard, then sometimes afterwards people say, oh, I don't know about that workshop or training, that was a bit confronting or a bit anti something or a bit full on. That's not a sign you did something wrong. That can be a sign you did an amazing job. And similarly, when people have a feeling of being affirmed and like, oh, wow, I really learned a lot and I really connected with that. This feels really important and I'm really motivated. That's like a positive general feeling. They might take that away. Neither of those is like more or less valuable than the other. but it's really highly skilled labor that you're being asked to do. And people will frame it as just come and talk about your personal experience. Or can you just tell us a bit about what it's like for you as a trans and non-binary person? How did you talk to your family about this? Or what did your parents say? Or how's your GP about this stuff? Did you find it difficult to access health services that you needed? Or they might ask really horrifyingly much more invasive versions of those questions. But whatever the direct questions are, or however people raise those topics, I think it's good to be clear with yourself ahead of time as much as you can what it is that you are willing to go into and what you're not willing to go into, and to know that you can create emotional connection with this content without exploiting your own story if you don't want to. And there might be aspects of your own experience that you really do want to draw on and that you can directly talk about. It can be helpful, like as a Pākehā person, for me, talking about being Pākehā, talking about a kind of white colonial worldview, talking about my mother being English, all of those things can be really important. Fronting, trying to be a responsible Pākehā person as a non-binary person, that's relevant. That's quite different to feeling like I have to exploit some really vulnerable part of myself in order to get people to care enough to try and do something differently. But it's taken so many years for me working as a trans educator to like figure out what my boundaries are. Mm-hmm. So if that's hard to figure out, it is not strange, and you're not wrong that it's challenging. Again, it speaks to the need for peer groups and supervision and people to check in with. And a lot of us are doing this work in organizations where that's not available. So hopefully that shifts. Moira?
Yeah, I think I also just wanted to affirm that by communicating those boundaries, if people are asking questions that you don't feel comfortable answering or that aren't appropriate, by communicating that you won't be answering that, but you'll engage with some other aspect of the topic or whatever, like that's potentially quite a useful learning point for them as well. I think for a lot of people who don't have knowledge around this stuff or haven't engaged with it before, they don't necessarily appreciate how full on some of the questions they might ask can be. And if they have that opportunity to interact with you and to be told no in this educative setting, that's possibly quite a useful thing, learning point for them in terms of how they engage with other colleagues, with family members, with people in the community, with trans clients that they might come across. That it's useful for people to learn that it's not actually okay for them to ask anything they feel curious about at any time. That our stories are our own. I wondered, Jono, how's the chat going? Do we have any questions coming through from
we people? Got some lovely compliments, which I'm loving.
Yeah, not too many questions. Everybody's very chatty, but they're just putting stuff out there, which is great, and I love the stuff that they're all saying. But yeah, we don't have too many questions. Oh, this is a question coming through right now.
No, it's just someone saying thanks and they have to go, and kia ora.
Oh, but here is a question that I'm going to throw out that seems great. So just somebody's asking, they're wondering how we can better share these stories of success where organizations and tangata have been able to embed trans and rainbow friendly mahi. How do we support those organizations to put it all to other orgs about the value in this work as well? So that kind of systemic, it doesn't always have to be us doing the work. That sometimes we can get organizations who have done the work to do that, pass the parcel, hand the rako over to another org. Hey, we're putting the challenge out to use as well. So
we have recently done some work in that space with our philanthropic funders for Te Ngākau Kahukura. And I think yeah, if you work alongside an organization and say, often we refer to what we do as coaching, if you're coaching that organization or people in it to do better, and then they do something that you think is really impressive, encouraging them to find platforms to talk about that. And maybe like, you know, the Philanthropy New Zealand Summit was a place where we could get some of our Rainbow Funders network to front the work that they were doing and to talk with people who are from the organizations that connect to that group, which is not just Te Ngākau Kahukura, but a whole lot of different organizations doing rainbow and trans and intersex work, that we could collaborate and demonstrate our partnership and our relationship to other people in that sector, in that space. And that was really helpful, I think. So looking for opportunities that are like that, so that instead of a 101 talk, instead of a we come in and we say what Te Ngākau Kahukura thinks you should do as a funder or a decision maker in this space, we demonstrate where these organizations are currently at, and they don't have to be perfect, and we can demonstrate that it's an ongoing process and a learning. So I think there's a risk under capitalism and with competitive funding, there's a risk that organizations always want to be seen as complete and perfect and finished, and they've done this journey and they've got the process sorted. You know, it's like, that's unlikely to be accurate. And if you can do it as a less like a kind of less of a media puff piece and more like demonstrating in a presentation or a workshop or a talk what that collaborative relationship is like, I think it can be meaningful, helpful. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, totally. I think, getting organizations to think about within their sector, can they go and talk to conferences or go to sector meetings or write journal articles, do evaluation of whether what they've done has been successful, and write about it and talk about it, and share those stories of success. I'm looking at the time and realizing that we have had a lot of things to say as usual. So maybe that's a good time to start wrapping up.
Yeah.
And I'll just share, Joey mentioned that we've got some handouts for this webinar, which are up on our website now. So some tips for allies, for those of you who are working in organisations and want to build trans inclusion into that work, and some tips for trans educators as well, for those of us who are doing this work around how you are wonderful and amazing, and that we want to make sure that the work that you're doing is well supported and valued and recognised for the really important mahi that it is. So those are up there now if you want to go and have a look, and the recording of this webinar session will be up there as well if you want to watch it again or share it with anybody that you work with in the future, as well as there's recordings of other webinars that we've done on similar and related topics. Other webinar recordings are up on our website as well. We're also on social media. If you follow us on Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn, we share there about other sessions that we have coming up. The recording of the session, as well as being up on our website, will be on our YouTube channel as well. So subscribe to that if you do YouTube. But otherwise, just thank you so much, Joey and Jono, for your thoughts and energy today, and thanks everybody for being with us. Lovely to see so much chat going on. While we were talking, I didn't get a chance to kind of catch up on what everybody was saying, but it looked like it was pretty lively in there. Thanks everybody. Hope to see you all again soon, and I'll just close up with a karakia tātou, unuhia ki te urutapu nui kia wātea, kia mama, te ngākau, te tinana, te wairoa, i te aratakata. Koia rā e rongo, whakairi ake ki runga kia tina, huie, tae kia. Kia ora. Thanks everyone.